The myth of avoidance has become one of the most misunderstood dynamics in relationships, and often it leaves people hurt, confused, and questioning their worth. When someone pulls away or seems distant, our instinct is to translate that into rejection. We tell ourselves a story that they don't care, they don't love us, or that we've done something wrong. But the truth is far more complex. Not every moment of retreat is about a lack of love. Sometimes it is the opposite. Sometimes avoidance isn't about pushing you away, but about a heart that is overwhelmed by the depth of its own feelings and doesn't yet know how to hold them. It is easier for us to believe the simpler narrative that if someone doesn't move toward us, it must mean they are moving away from us. But love and fear often show up hand in hand, and avoidance can sometimes be love wrapped in fear. Think about the way human beings respond to vulnerability. To be seen fully, to let another person hold our most tender truths is terrifying. For some people, the experience of love doesn't just bring joy and connection, it also brings up the fear of loss, of being consumed, of becoming dependent on someone who might eventually walk away. These fears are not born out of indifference but out of deep attachment. When an avoidant person takes a step back, it may not be because they don't want you close, but because closeness feels like standing at the edge of a cliff without knowing if the ground will hold. Their retreat is not always a rejection, but a strategy for survival, a way to manage the tidal wave of emotions they don't yet know how to swim in. Avoidance can sometimes be an act of love's intensity rather than love's absence. If you look closely, you might see that the person who seems to pull away is still watching you from a distance, still listening for your voice, still moved by your presence. They might not rush into your arms or drown you in words of affection, but they show their feelings in smaller, quieter ways. Maybe they remember the little things you've said. Maybe they bring you something you mentioned in passing. Maybe they simply show up, even in silence. These may not look like grand gestures of passion, but they are love's fingerprints left behind by someone who is still learning how to stay close without losing themselves. The myth of avoidance teaches us to label distance as disinterest. It convinces us that if someone doesn't match our pace, they must not care. But love doesn't always move in straight lines. Some people love in circles, in rhythms of approach and retreat. They come close, then step back, not to escape you but to find their footing. And when they return, it is because they are trying to love you in a way that feels safe to them. The challenge is that this rhythm can be confusing and painful for the person on the receiving end. It can feel like whiplash, like being pulled close and then pushed away. But if we pause long enough to notice the difference between avoidance born of disconnection and avoidance born of fear, we begin to see the deeper truth. Fear-based avoidance carries tenderness in its shadow. It says, "I feel so much that I don't know how to handle it." It says, "I want you so much that I'm scared of what that means for me." It is a paradox, and it takes patience and empathy to understand. But when you realize that avoidance doesn't always mean a lack of love, something shifts. You stop translating every step back as abandonment, and you start to see it as part of the messy, imperfect dance of intimacy. The myth of avoidance hurts us because it keeps us locked in assumptions. We decide that distance equals rejection, and we harden our hearts in response. But what if instead of assuming the worst, we became curious about what lies beneath the behavior? What if we asked ourselves whether that distance is really a wall, or just a shield that someone hasn't yet learned how to put down? In that space of curiosity, compassion grows. And in that compassion, love has a chance to deepen instead of collapse under misunderstanding. Avoidant love isn't easy to navigate. It requires patience, honesty, and a willingness to sit with discomfort. It demands that both people risk vulnerability, one in learning to stay, the other in learning to trust that the retreat is not rejection. When we give ourselves permission to see avoidance differently, we begin to understand that it is not always the absence of love, but often the presence of it in its rawest, most fearful form. And when we can hold that truth, we stop mistaking silence for indifference and distance for abandonment, and we begin to see avoidance for what it really is, a trembling attempt to love without breaking. Love wrapped in fear is one of the most complicated experiences we can have because it holds two truths at the same time. On one hand, there is a genuine, undeniable affection that longs to connect, to be close, to build something real. On the other, there is a trembling hesitation that whispers about the risks of getting too close, about the possibility of being hurt, abandoned, or consumed. When someone loves but fears, their heart becomes a battlefield. It is not that they don't care enough, it is that they care so much it terrifies them. They feel the depth of their emotions more strongly than they know how to handle, and so love becomes a weight they both crave and fear carrying. For many people who lean toward avoidance, love is overwhelming because it threatens their sense of safety. When you let someone into your heart, you are offering them access to the most fragile parts of you. For someone who has learned to protect themselves through distance, this can feel like handing over the keys to a vault they have spent years keeping locked. The emotions are real, often more real than they want to admit, but the fear of being hurt makes them hesitate. They are pulled in two directions at once, the desire for closeness and the instinct for self-preservation. This tug-of-war creates a pattern where they might lean in with tenderness, only to pull back when the fear becomes too loud. This fear is not always rational, but it is powerful. It might come from past wounds, experiences where trust was broken or vulnerability was met with rejection. It might come from childhood lessons where needing others was seen as weakness, or where love was conditional and uncertain. When these old stories mix with present feelings, love becomes complicated. The heart says, I want you, but the body says, be careful. And so the person who loves deeply may appear distant, confusing the one they love, and sometimes confusing themselves as well. It is not that they lack love, it is that their love comes with ghosts, shadows of what once hurt them, and those shadows wrap around their present feelings like chains. Love wrapped in fear often shows itself in contradictions. A person might light up when they see you, but then retreat when you get too close. They might share something personal and then shut down when the conversation becomes too intimate. They might hold your hand with sincerity but hesitate to say the words their heart already knows. These contradictions are not signs of dishonesty but of struggle. They are trying to reconcile the part of them that wants connection with the part of them that is terrified of losing control. And in that conflict, they sometimes pull away not because they don't care, but because they care too much to risk falling apart. What makes this dynamic painful is that love wrapped in fear often leaves the other person feeling unwanted. It is natural to interpret distance as rejection, but in this case, distance can actually be a sign of how much the connection matters. If you didn't matter, they wouldn't fear losing themselves. If you weren't important, they wouldn't be triggered by the thought of dependence or closeness. The very fact that they are struggling is evidence that they feel something powerful. Fear doesn't show up when there's nothing at stake. It only shows up when there is something to lose. The tender truth is that love wrapped in fear needs patience and understanding, though not at the cost of your own boundaries. It requires seeing beyond the surface behavior and recognizing the trembling heart underneath. It asks us to remember that fear doesn't cancel love, it complicates it. It makes it harder for love to flow smoothly, but it doesn't erase its existence. The work then becomes about creating safety, about showing that closeness doesn't mean suffocation and that vulnerability doesn't always lead to betrayal. Over time, this reassurance can help soften the fear, though it is a gradual process. It is important to understand that fear is not a flaw, it is a response. It is the nervous system protecting itself from what it imagines could happen based on past pain. Love in this case becomes a trigger because it feels like stepping into unknown territory where the stakes are high. When someone who is avoidant allows themselves to stay, even in small ways, it is an act of immense courage. Every step closer is not just about loving another person, it is about wrestling with their own history and choosing to believe that this time could be different. The presence of fear doesn't diminish the depth of love, it often amplifies it. Fear shows up most where love is strongest, because the more you care, the more you fear losing what you've found. Love wrapped in fear, then, is a paradox. It is fragile yet powerful, hesitant yet sincere. It doesn't look like the movies or sound like perfect declarations, but it is real. It is messy, imperfect, and sometimes frustrating, but it holds within it a longing that is honest. And when we begin to see love not just as something expressed in ease but also in struggle, we can start to recognize the beauty even in the hesitation, because behind that hesitation is a heart that wants deeply, even if it doesn't yet know how to show it fully. Small acts speak loudly when it comes to love, especially in relationships where one person struggles with avoidance or fear of intimacy. Many people expect love to declare itself through grand gestures, sweeping words, or dramatic acts of devotion, but the truth is that some of the most powerful expressions of love are quiet, almost invisible to anyone but the person who knows how to look for them. For someone who finds it difficult to be vulnerable, the biggest steps toward intimacy might not come in the form of open declarations or constant closeness, but instead in the subtle choices they make each day. These small acts become the language through which they reveal the depth of their feelings, even when the words are too heavy to speak. When someone who is avoidant or fearful of closeness chooses to show up, even in the smallest way, it is not insignificant. It could be remembering something you said weeks ago and bringing it up later, proving they were listening even when they seemed distracted. It might be checking in on you after a long day, not with a flood of questions, but with a simple message that says, "I was thinking of you." It might be sitting beside you in silence, not filling the air with words, but offering their presence as a quiet form of companionship. To an outside observer, these moments may not look like much, but to the one receiving them, they are love distilled into its purest form. There is something profound about love that doesn't need to be dressed up or performed. When someone struggles with vulnerability, their love is not absent, it is just cautious. Instead of shouting it from the rooftops, they whisper it through consistency and through the details. They might bring you coffee in the way you like it, remembering exactly how much sugar you take. They might hold on to something you mentioned in passing and surprise you with it later. They might quietly rearrange their schedule to make space for you, even if they don't announce it. These actions might never come with a spotlight, but they are powerful because they carry intentionality. They say, "I care enough to notice, I care enough to remember, I care enough to quietly show up." Small acts of love often speak the loudest because they are grounded in everyday life. Anyone can make a dramatic gesture once, but it takes real devotion to show up consistently in ways that often go unnoticed. These are the choices that build trust, the kind that reassure you that you matter. It is in the hand reaching for yours when words fall short. It is in the way they listen without judgment, even when they don't know what to say. It is in the simple act of being there when it would be easier to walk away. These are not small things at all, they are the foundation on which love is built. What makes these quiet gestures so meaningful is the vulnerability they carry beneath the surface. For someone who fears intimacy, allowing themselves to show love in any form is an act of courage. Every text they send, every effort they make to check in, every moment they choose to stay present instead of retreating, is a silent declaration that you matter to them. It might not always be as loud or as obvious as you want it to be, but it is real. And when you learn to recognize those moments, you begin to see the depth of their love written between the lines of their behavior. We often underestimate the power of presence. Simply being there, even without words, can be the loudest statement of love. Love does not always need to arrive dressed in fireworks. Sometimes it shows up as steady warmth, as a gentle hand on your back, as someone remembering to lock the door so you feel safe, or someone noticing you're tired and quietly taking care of what needs to be done. These gestures may seem ordinary, but they become extraordinary when you realize they are chosen deliberately, not out of obligation but out of care. The challenge is that small acts are easy to overlook, especially when we are conditioned to look for love in louder, more dramatic forms. It takes awareness to see that the person who struggles with grand displays may be loving you in ways that are deeply significant but subtle. The more you learn to notice these quiet moments, the more you realize how much effort they actually take for someone who is cautious with their heart. What might look small to you could be monumental to them. Love is not always measured by what is said, but by what is done. A word can be empty without action, but an action, even the smallest one, often carries the weight of truth. The small acts reveal where someone's attention lies, what they value, and where their heart is invested. When someone consistently makes space for you in their everyday choices, they are saying, without words, that you are important. And sometimes that means more than any declaration could. Small acts speak loudly because they reveal the substance of love rather than its performance. They are the quiet gestures that slowly build intimacy, the everyday choices that prove devotion, and the subtle reminders that you are seen, heard, and cared for. They may not look like much from the outside, but they hold extraordinary weight. For someone who is learning to love through fear and caution, these small acts are monumental, and when you recognize them for what they are, you begin to see love not just in the dramatic moments, but in the quiet details that hold everything together. Courage behind the silence is one of the most misunderstood expressions of love and vulnerability. In a world that glorifies loud declarations and constant communication, silence is often mistaken for indifference or detachment. But silence can carry a truth that words sometimes cannot. For someone who struggles with avoidance or fear of intimacy, silence is not the absence of care but the presence of immense courage. It is a way of sitting with emotions too big to name, of holding space for feelings that overwhelm, of being present without needing to perform. Silence can be a doorway to connection if we learn to listen differently. For many people, silence is not natural. It feels uncomfortable, unsettling, even threatening. We tend to fill the gaps with chatter because quiet exposes us. It leaves us alone with our thoughts, and it makes us visible in ways we can't hide behind words. For someone who fears intimacy, speaking about their emotions can feel like standing naked in a storm. Every word feels like a risk of rejection, a chance that what they reveal will not be met with kindness or understanding. Silence then becomes their shelter, but behind that quiet is not an empty heart. It is a heart gathering courage, testing whether it is safe enough to emerge. Silence requires strength because it asks us to hold back the easy escape of explanation and to simply stay present. It asks us to sit with discomfort instead of running from it. For the person who avoids closeness, silence is often the bravest thing they can offer. It means they are choosing to stay, even when staying feels unbearable. It means they are trusting that their presence, even unspoken, is enough. It may not look like the dramatic gestures of love we expect, but it carries a depth of meaning that cannot be dismissed. Courage behind the silence shows up in the moments when someone could retreat completely, but instead chooses to remain near. It is in the quiet evenings where no words are exchanged, but the comfort of being together fills the space. It is in the patient listening, the long pauses, the willingness to sit in shared stillness without needing to fix or explain. This kind of silence is not withdrawal, it is presence in its purest form. It is saying, I am here with you, even if I don't know how to put it into words. What we often fail to realize is that silence can be more vulnerable than words. Speaking can sometimes be a shield, a way of covering up what we truly feel with rehearsed lines or half-truths. But silence leaves us exposed. When we allow ourselves to be quiet with someone, we are trusting that they won't fill the space with judgment or assumption. We are trusting that our presence alone can be enough. That is not avoidance, that is courage disguised in stillness. It takes bravery to let love exist without constant reassurance, to let it breathe in the quiet, to believe that connection can be felt even without words. For the person who is cautious in love, silence is a way of stepping into vulnerability without being overwhelmed by it. It is a bridge between fear and expression. When they sit in silence, they are not abandoning you, they are practicing trust. They are allowing the moment to exist without control, without defense, and that act of surrender is courageous. The mistake many of us make is to interpret silence as rejection. We panic in the quiet, telling ourselves stories about what it must mean. But often silence is the opposite. It is an effort to stay present when leaving would be easier. It is a sign that the person cares enough to hold space, even when they don't know what to say. If we can shift our perspective, we can begin to see silence not as an absence but as an offering. It is love shown in a different form, one that doesn't rely on noise but on presence. The courage behind the silence is in the willingness to be known without performing. It is in the vulnerability of allowing someone close enough to notice the pauses, the hesitations, the unspoken feelings that live beneath the surface. Silence asks us to pay attention, to see with our hearts instead of just our ears. And when we do, we discover that silence is not empty at all. It is full of meaning, full of emotion, full of courage. Love is not always loud, and sometimes its quietest expressions are its most powerful. To sit in silence with someone you love, to trust that your presence is enough, to allow yourself to be seen in your stillness, that is a radical act of courage. It is proof that love is not only in the words we say, but in the spaces we are willing to share. And when silence is honored instead of feared, it becomes one of the most intimate expressions of connection, a place where hearts can meet without needing to speak. The tender risk of vulnerability is at the core of every meaningful connection, yet it is the very thing most of us try to avoid. To be vulnerable is to step into uncertainty, to reveal parts of ourselves that we cannot control, and to trust another person with pieces of our heart that could be mishandled or misunderstood. It is tender because it exposes us, and it is risky because there are no guarantees that the other person will meet us with kindness, care, or acceptance. Yet without vulnerability, love cannot grow. Without the willingness to risk being seen, we cannot experience the depth of intimacy that makes relationships transformative. Vulnerability feels dangerous because it is rooted in the possibility of hurt. When we allow someone to see our flaws, our fears, and our hopes, we are giving them access to the most delicate parts of us. It is far easier to stay behind walls, to present only the version of ourselves we believe will be accepted. But love cannot thrive behind a mask. Real connection asks us to put down our armor and trust that even in our imperfection, we are worthy of being loved. For someone who leans toward avoidance, this risk feels almost unbearable. They have often learned to equate vulnerability with danger, either through past experiences of betrayal or through a deep fear that needing someone else makes them weak. For them, love becomes a battlefield where vulnerability feels like surrender, and surrender feels like defeat. And yet, the truth is that vulnerability is not weakness at all. It is courage in its purest form. To risk rejection while still choosing to reveal yourself is one of the bravest acts a person can make. Vulnerability is the act of saying, "Here I am with all my flaws and fears, and I hope you will accept me as I am." That hope carries both beauty and fear. It opens the possibility of deeper intimacy, but it also opens the door to disappointment. The risk is always there, and that is what makes it so tender. The tender risk of vulnerability shows up in countless ways in love. It can be in the simple act of saying, "I love you" first, not knowing if the other person feels the same. It can be in admitting fear, or asking for reassurance, or letting your tears be seen when you would rather hide them. It can be in sharing a dream you've held silently for years, or confessing a mistake you fear will drive the other person away. Each of these moments is a leap into uncertainty, a choice to trust love more than fear. For someone who has spent their life protecting themselves, these small acts can feel monumental. They are not just gestures of connection, they are personal revolutions. The risk of vulnerability is magnified because love does not promise safety. There is always the chance that your openness will not be met with the response you long for. Sometimes people will mishandle your heart. Sometimes they will not know what to do with the truth you share. That possibility makes the act of vulnerability both fragile and profound. It is like handing someone a glass heart. They could cherish it, or they could drop it, and you cannot control the outcome. And yet, without offering that glass heart, without risking the fragility, love remains shallow and incomplete. It is in vulnerability that love becomes real. To be seen in your joy is easy, but to be seen in your fear, your grief, your shame, and still be held with care, that is where intimacy lives. When someone chooses to be vulnerable with you, they are not just sharing their words, they are entrusting you with their humanity. It is an honor and a responsibility to hold that with gentleness. For those who struggle with avoidance, the tender risk of vulnerability is often their greatest hurdle. Yet every time they allow themselves to soften, even in the smallest way, it is proof of their courage. The paradox of vulnerability is that while it feels like exposure, it is also the path to strength. The very act of risking rejection strengthens our capacity for connection, because it teaches us that our worth does not crumble when someone else cannot meet us fully. Vulnerability reminds us that our humanity is not defined by the response we receive, but by the courage we show in revealing ourselves anyway. And when that vulnerability is met with love, it becomes one of the most healing experiences a human being can know. The tender risk of vulnerability is the heartbeat of love, because it is the place where two people meet without masks, without defenses, without guarantees. It is where trust is born, where intimacy deepens, where connection becomes sacred. It is never easy, and it is never without fear, but it is the only way to experience the fullness of love. To choose vulnerability is to choose love over protection, courage over fear, and growth over safety. It is to believe, even with trembling hands, that being truly seen is worth the risk. Love isn't always loud, and that truth can be difficult to accept in a world that celebrates grand gestures, dramatic expressions, and sweeping declarations. We are taught to equate love with fireworks, with constant affirmation, with words spoken loudly and often. But love in its truest and most enduring form often moves quietly. It doesn't always announce itself in ways that are easy to recognize. Sometimes it whispers instead of shouts. Sometimes it is found in the small, consistent choices rather than the spectacular moments. To believe that love must always be loud is to miss the beauty of the quieter forms it can take, the ones that are steady, grounded, and deeply real. Quiet love often shows up in the spaces where words fail. It can be in the steady presence of someone who stays by your side even when you have nothing to give back. It can be in the hand that reaches for yours in a crowded room, not to make a statement to the world, but to remind you silently that you are not alone. It can be in the way someone remembers the smallest details about you, the way you take your coffee, the sound of your laughter, the little quirks that most people overlook. These moments don't shout love from the rooftops, but they carry a depth of devotion that is undeniable once you learn to notice them. For someone who struggles with vulnerability or who leans toward avoidance, quiet love is often the safest way they know how to show they care. They may not flood you with constant affection or speak endlessly about their feelings, but they reveal themselves in subtler ways. They show up when you need them. They make space for you in their world. They sacrifice in ways they might never verbalize. Their love might not look like the movies, but it is no less real. In fact, it is often more meaningful because it comes with intention and effort, not performance. The mistake many of us make is to measure love only by its volume. We expect loud declarations to prove sincerity, but words can be empty when they are not matched by action. Quiet love, on the other hand, is proven through consistency. It is not always poetic, but it is reliable. It is found in the partner who shows up day after day, who listens without judgment, who creates safety not through speeches but through presence. This kind of love may not always feed our desire for drama, but it feeds our need for stability. It grounds us. It teaches us that love is not only about intensity but about endurance. Love isn't always loud because loudness is not the only language of the heart. Some people speak love through acts of service, doing the small tasks that lighten your load. Others speak it through time, making sure you feel prioritized even when life is demanding. Others speak it through touch, a gentle embrace that communicates what words cannot. And some show love by simply staying even when staying is hard. These expressions may not come with fanfare, but they are love in action, and they matter more than the loudest words spoken without follow-through. Quiet love is especially powerful because it invites us to look beyond appearances. It asks us to slow down and pay attention, to notice the details, to see the heart in the everyday. It reminds us that love doesn't always need to be proven through spectacle. It can simply be lived. The dinner prepared after a long day, the patient listening when you're overwhelmed, the smile that greets you when you walk through the door. These are not loud acts, but they are the fabric of a loving life. Without them, love is all performance with no foundation. What often makes quiet love difficult to recognize is our own longing for certainty. We want reassurance, we want words, we want signs we can point to as proof. And while those are important, they are not the only measure of devotion. Quiet love asks us to trust actions more than noise, to believe that presence can mean more than performance, and to understand that devotion can be steady without being dramatic. When you begin to see love in this way, you realize it is not absent in the silence, it is simply expressed differently. There is something profoundly beautiful about love that doesn't need to be loud to be true. It doesn't draw attention to itself or demand recognition. It simply exists, steady and sure, like the roots of a tree that hold it firmly in place, even when no one notices them. This kind of love might not make headlines, but it sustains relationships for a lifetime. It is the quiet rhythm of two people choosing each other every day, not because they need to prove it to anyone, but because they mean it. Love isn't always loud, but that doesn't make it any less powerful. In fact, its quietness can make it more enduring. It is the love that stays after the fireworks fade, the love that holds you when the world is heavy, the love that doesn't need to be shouted because it is already known. To recognize quiet love is to understand that real intimacy is not about volume but about depth. It is not about how loud someone can declare their feelings, but how consistently they choose to show up, in ways big and small, day after day. And when you begin to see love in its quiet forms, you realize it has been there all along, steady and strong, speaking in whispers that matter more than the loudest words ever could.